Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel, and we're focused on a suffix that Rabbi Yochanan had regarding a katan. And in the original formulation, the Gemara understood that Rabbi Yochanan was vacillating about whether or not a katan has machshava. And then the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. If he's asking about whether a katan has machshava, and the Torah validates his machshava, then why not ask about Maisa? And that's where the Gemara, if you recall from yesterday, on Daf Yud Beis Amid Beis, had quoted a Mishnah in Masechta Chullin. And the question was, at what point is the Gemara Kli, and the utensil is called a Kli, such that now it's Makabel Tuma. And we spoke about cases where the child took various kinds of objects on the seashore, and he started digging them out. And he's going to use it to carry the water and the sand and so forth and so on. And the Mishnah there differentiates between machshava and maisa. So the fact that the katan has decided that he's going to take this acorn and hollow it out to use it as a utensil, that itself does not generate a shem kli. However, if he does a maisa and he goes ahead and he carves out the kli, then the maisa of the katan is valid, creates and generates a shem kli, and therefore it's makabel tuma. So based on the fact that this Mishnah in Kalim is pretty explicit, differentiating in the case of a katan between maisa and machshava, in which case ein lahem machshava but yesh lahem maisa. So the Gemara goes back to the drawing board to try to reformulate the original suffix of Rabbi Yochanan. And therefore, here on the top of Daf Yud Gimel, Omar Lei, on the top line, Machshava Greidosa lo kami boiler. Rabbi Yochanan never had a question about Machshava. The Machshava of Katan is not valid. It doesn't generate any chalos, any change of legal status. But Ki kami boile, what was Rabbi Yochanan vacillating about? And this is the second formulation of Rabbi Yochanan. Machshavto nikeres mitoch maisav. What happens if he has a machshava and then he does a maisa? We're not sure exactly how to interpret the maisa. Kigon, davikaimi ola bedoram. There was a carbon ola that was in the south, and the shechita of a carbon ola has to be in the north of the Azara. And asyua bat sofon ushchata. The katan transported the animal, this ola, from the south side over to the north side, and then he shechted it. Mai. And now the Gemara identifies the vacillation of Rabbi Yochanan from the fact that he transported the animal from the south to the north. We see that he had kavana, and his intention, his machshava, was l'shem carbon ola, and therefore we validate his shechita. O dilma, should we say no? Makom hu delo esramile. Maybe that part of the Azara in the south was so full of carbonos, of animals, that there was no room. So by chance, it happened to be that he took it to the right side, meaning the north side of the Azara, but he had no kavana. So in the case of a katan, we need a much stronger indication through his maisa that would solidify and give us a certain element of certainty about his machshava. If there's no absolute certainty, and you could explain the maisa in different ways and say that that maisa does not in any way indicate his machshava, then we cannot rely on the maisa of the katan, because we have to have an integration of both machshava and maisa. So again, at this point in the Gemara, the second formulation of Rabbi Yochanan's suffix, he's vacillating about a case where on the one hand it's machshavto nikeres mitoch ma'aseh, that his ma'aseh definitely seems to indicate what the child's kavana was. And again, when we say child here, we mean cheresh shota v'katan, all three. Or do we say no? Maybe we can reinterpret his ma'aseh in such a way that it doesn't really prove what his machshava was. So the Gemara now rejects the second in formulation of Rabbi Yochanan. Hanami Amara, Rabbi Yochanan Charazimna. Why would Rabbi Yochanan have to repeat what he already has committed himself to say? Disnan, and now we're quoting a Mishnah in Machshirit. Now, Machshirit means that any foodstuff, in order to be susceptible to contamination through tumah, like for example, if a sheret's fallen in it, it has to first be placed into liquid. And there are 7 different liquids, all of which are derived from one pasuk of mayim, because water is the most basic liquid, and all liquids are somehow related to mayim. And the Torah says, "Mikol." This is in Vayikra Perek Yud Aleph. "Mikol ha'ochel asher ye'ochel asher yavo alav mayim yitma." So the Torah says, "Yavo alav mayim." Now, from mayim we derive 6 other liquids that are machshirim, and they are yayin, dvash, shemen, chalav, tal, and dam. And the sum total is 7. Now, there has to be a desire or at least maybe the word desire is going too far. There has to be at least a satisfaction on the part of the person that his food is now covered with liquid. Actually, in the pasuk, it seems to say ki yitain mayim, that he actually put the water, meaning he took the food stuff and submerged it into the water. But because you could read ki yitain as ki yutan with a kubutz under the yud, which means that it was placed, but not that he placed it. So the Gemara comes up with a compromise. It's got to be ki yitain dumya de ki yutan. And this is a sugya in Perek Elu Mitzios. This is what we learned in 4th grade, the first Gemara that we ever learned. We didn't understand it then. We probably don't understand it now. But anyway, that's the halacha of machshirin. So now, Hamala Peirosov Lagag Mipnei Aknima. The reason why he lifted up his fruits onto the roof was not because he wants them to get wet from the dew, but rather there are insects and he doesn't want the food stuff to be attacked by insects, and somehow the insects don't get all the way up to the roof. But then V'yarda Lehem Tal. And now the question is this called Kiyitain? Because he, on the one hand, is not motivated by the Tal, he's motivated in order to protect the food from the insects. And therefore, the Mishnah establishes a machshirim einon b'chiyutan. There's no machshirin here because kiyutan means that it's got to be something that he's happy about. And there's no intention whatsoever here that the dew should fall on his fruits. However, then the Mishnah says, in this kavim lakach, if, for example, he had a double purpose. He was motivated, number one, to protect the fruits on the roof by bringing them up to the roof. And number two, he would be very happy if the dew would now fall on the fruits and wet the fruits. Harei hein b'chiyutan. Then it's considered as if he placed the dew on the food, and therefore this is one of the 7 machshirim is tal. And henceforth, if any sherets would fall on this food, then it would be makabel tumah. Now we get to our discussion. The Mishnah continues and says that helum cheresh shota v'katan, if somebody who doesn't have das was the one who brought the fruits up to the roof, afal pishin is kavnu lekach, even if the cheres shot of a cotton had a double intention, meaning they would be very happy if the fruits got wet, got moist. Maybe the moisture will clean off the fruit on the outside. Nevertheless, Einon B'chi Yutan, Maisa ve'ein le machshava. Meaning, when we see the child, the miner, put the fruits up on the roof, we have no absolute certainty that that indicates the machshava that the child had in mind that the dew should fall and wet the fruits. So again, it's an issue of whether or not machshavto nikeres mitoch maisa. Very similar and parallel to the case where the child took the carbon olive from the south and brought it to the north and then shechted it. The Omer Rabbi Yochanan lo shano el shelo hipei pahen, aval hipei pahen harei ze b'chiyutan. Meaning, the problem here with the machshirin in the case where the tal falls on the fruits that were brought up to the roof by the child is because it's not absolutely clear that the child wanted and had interest and benefit from the tal falling on the fruits. But, says Rabbi Yochanan, hipech ba, if what he did was, after the tal fell on the top side of the fruit, he went ahead, climbed up to the roof, and turned over the fruit so that the tal would now encompass the entire fruit and fall on the bottom side, which is now on the top. That would be clearly machshavto nikeres mitoch masav. Clearly, he indicates his desire to have the fruits wet, and that's why he turned it over. So therefore, once we have this statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to the Mishnah Machshirin, we wonder why Rabbi Yochanan vacillated about the issue of the carbon, the ola, that was brought by the child. I mean, it's basically a repeat performance. So the Gemara says now, that was not the vacillation of Rabbi Yochanan. We're up to round 3, the third formulation. Hachi kami baile. The oraisa o derabana. In a case where it's clearly indicative of his machshava, meaning the maisa is absolutely, certainly indicative of his machshava, and then we recognize the katon's machshava, is that a doraisa halacha or a drabanan halacha? That's what Rabbi Yochanan was questioning. And we'll see some nafkaminas in a minute. But before that, let's just point out that if the whole deal of machshavto nikeres mitoch maisav is only derabanan, then the Rabbanan can be makil. I'm sorry, scratch that. The Rabbanan could be machmir and allow a food to be makabel tumah. The fact that it now is makabel tumah could be a chumrah d'Rabbanan. And therefore, when the katan through his maisa clearly indicates his machshava, and we now see absolutely, without absolute certainty, why the katan placed the fruits on top of the roof. He wanted them to get wet from the tal. That would generate a din of machshirin on a drabanan level, according to one side in Rabbi Yochanan. However, the nafkamina is going to be as far as a carbon ola is concerned, because in the case of a carbon, we need a machshava that this is being shechted l'shem ola, and in the case of a katan, if on that side in Rabbi Yochanan Safek it's only the Rabbanon, that's not going to be machshir the carbon. So the Rabbanon could only be machmir, but not mekil. If we infer, I'm just reading the note over here, that the whole deal of machshavto, etc., is only drabanan, then it could be machmir. So therefore, we will not be able to validate the shchita of the katan on the carbon ola. And all we could do is, on a drabanan level, we can be machshir something to be kabel tuma. So if a miner brought produce onto the roof, turned it over, and it got wet, and now we said it's makabel tuma, that's not a doraisa again on that side. It's only derabanan. But so what? Derabanan could decide that something is makabel tuma. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Masni Hachi. Now, basically, what we're going to have now is almost an identical repeat of Rabbi Yochanan's vacillation with one slight change. Amar Rab Chia bar Abba boy Rabbi Yochanan katan yesh lo ma'aseh o ein lo ma'aseh. So now we're going to have again that same shakla v'tarya that we had yesterday on Daf Yud Beis. And that is, why is Rabbi Yochanan focused on Maisa? Amalei Rabbi Ami says to Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Tiboy le machshava. And Maishna machshav de lo kami boile. There must be a reason why Rabbi Yochanan, according to this formulation of Rabbi Chia bar Abba, was vacillating about a Maisa, and he had no suffix, no doubt about machshava. So Maishna machshava de lo kami boile. Why was it absolutely clear in the mind of Rabbi Yochanan that machshava alone? So let's say, for example, if the Katan makes a statement, I'm doing this because of that, it's meaningless. Tisnan ein lahem machshava. Right? We had that Mishnah, as we quoted earlier, that there's no machshava. So then, if that be the case, why is he vacillating and doubting about Maisa? Maisa nami lo tiboy tisnan yesh lem Maisa. And the answer is Hachi Kavi Baile Doraisa Durban. Now the Gemara gives us the bottom line of this whole suffix of Rabbi Yochanan, Pashat, and the final conclusion was Yesh Lahem Maisa Afilu Doraisa, Ein Lahem Machshava Afilu Mirabbanan. In other words, what we're doing now is we're creating two extremes, both of which are absolutely sure la halacha, certain la halacha, and then we're going to have a suffix in the middle. What are the two extremes? One extreme is when yeshlem maisa afilu doraisa, meaning if the maisa is absolutely clear. For example, when the katan moved the ola from south to north, he made a statement that he's doing this in order to shech the animal as a carbon ola, which requires tzafon, shchita v'tzafon. That clearly is operative and valid doraisa. On the other extreme, if let's say there was only a machshava but no maisa, meaning the child didn't take the carbon from the south and bring it to the north, it was already in the north, and he went ahead and he shechted it, and he says, I'm shechting this ola, that's not valid even to Rabbanan. Where is the suffix of Rabbi Yochanan? Right down the middle, machshavto nikers mitoch maisa. If let's say, on the one hand, we're dealing with a machshava, we need the machshava, the katan, but on the other hand, although he didn't make an absolute statement, this katan, that this is what he's doing for the reasons of X, Y, Z, but rather, he did a maisa that seems to indicate is midoraisa, ein lo midrabanan yesh. Shall we say that this is equal to a maisa, which we said is valid even doraisa, but again, a maisa is only valid doraisa when he made his declaration before he did the maisa. Here, what he did was he did some action which might indicate what his machshava was, and in such a case, we're not going to allow and validate his machshava, but that's only on a doraisa level. But on a drabana level, we can do so. Boy minei Shmuel mirafuna minayim l'nesasik b'kodshim shu pasul. In other words, in kodshim we need a machshava, and if a person he threw the knife and the knife bounced off the walls and shechted the animal, the korban, it's not valid. And where do we know this from? Shenemar v'shochet es ben habakar. Ben habakar means for the sake of a ben habakar. Shetei shchita l'shem ben habakar. Amalo, Shmuel says to Rav Huna, Zu biyadeinu hi. Okay, fine. You definitely require machshava. But la'akev b'nayin. How do we know that in event that he did not have this intention, the korban is possible? For that you need shino lava kosav liakiv. The Torah has to repeat itself. And the Gemara answers, "L'tzonchem tizbechu, l'daitchem zvuchu." So we have now another pasuk that again establishes that you need the machshava, and since the Torah repeats it twice, it's likuva. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Yud Gimel. Shchitas ovei kolchavim nevela. What does this mean? A guy's shchita is not valid. The animal is considered as if it dropped dead without shchita, and therefore it's nevela. But there's one fundamental difference that we've discussed in the past between nevela and treifa, and that is that a treifa animal is not metame. And if you shech the treifa animal, the carcass of the animal is not metame. But if the animal is considered an avela and it drops dead without shchita, then it's metame, which is called b'masa. Masa means if you lift it up. And therefore, b'metame b'masa, if a guy implements a shchita on an animal, even if we saw the shchita and we know it's a perfect shchita, it doesn't matter. The shchita of a guy is not a shchita. The animal now, the carcass of the animal is an avela, and an avela is metame. So the Gemara says, nevela in, iser hano lo. Wait a second. Why don't we assume that when the guy shechted the animal, he had an intention for the sake of idolatry? And if that be the case, it is avodah zara, which is asur b'hana. Nevela, the Torah says, give it to a guy. It's mutar b'hana. You could sell the carcass on the market. But not avodah zara. Avodah zara is asur b'hana. And from the fact that the Mishnah describes the nevela as an nevela, without indicating that it's asur b'hana as avodah zara, it indicates it's not avodah zara. So the Gemara says, "Mantana Omer Rabbi Yechia, Rabbi Amma, Rabbi Yochanan, Delok Rabbi Eliezer, Dik Rabbi Eliezer Omer Stam Machsheves Obi Kocham Lavodas Kocham." In other words, Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that when we don't know what's in the mindset that motivates the guy to shech the animal, we have to assume that in all likelihood he had in mind idolatry. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer would disagree with that Mishnah by classifying the carcass as nevela. He would say it's avodah zara, and the nafkamina is it's asur b'hana. You can't sell it to a guy. You can't, use it as for hides or whatever you want to do. Rav Ami Omer Hachi Ktani Shchitas Ovei Kochav Nevela Hadimin LaAvodah Zara. Now, there are two categories of idol worshippers. One category, which is, let's say, a regular guy, he's not an avid idolater. Maybe back in the day they were, but over the course of time, it was just minig avoseinu b'yadeinu. They did these things because of rote, but they weren't really devout idolaters. But then there's something called a min. A min is someone who's known to be totally dedicated to avodah zarah, to idol worship. And therefore, Rabbi Ami is medaik in the Mishnah from the fact that the Mishnah says shchitas ovei kochav. Now it's a little tricky here, but the phrase ovei kochav means stamagoy as opposed to a min, and therefore it's nevela. The Mishnah says it's nevela. It's not. We have no reason to assume. Again, we don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer that any guy who shechs an animal, he has in mind idol worshiper, idolatry, and therefore it's mutar b'hana. But the diuk of the Mishnah is, the Mishnah is telling us that if it would have been a min who's totally devout and dedicated to Avodah Zarah, then the carcass is Asur Bano. Tanina lahad tanarabban. We're going to try to derive, let me say it the other way. You, Rav Ami, wanted to derive your conclusion from our Mishnah. I'm going to quote to you a brisa that's explicit. And the brisa says, Shchitas min liavodas kol chavim. When a min goes ahead and he shechts an animal, it's for idolatry purposes. Pito, right? If he bakes bread, pas kusi. It's also because it's avodah zarah. Again, this depends on the old machlokas. What's the status of a kusi? But the brisa is saying that it's also. Now, you have to keep in mind, Rabbosai, that kusi might be a Jew, and yet he has the status of a min. And I'm not sure exactly of the history of it, but I have a feeling that in the early period of maybe even before Jesus showed up, on the scene, at the time of Paul and so forth, so there were Jews never who got schlepped into idolatry. And those Jews were called minim. Yeno yayin nesach. If this min, who's a Jew that took on idolatry, touches our wine, then it's considered yayin nesach. It's almost as if we saw him pour the wine onto his altar for idolatry purposes, for libations. Sfarav Sifrei Kosmin. His books are full of idol worship, and we have to burn them. Peirosov Tfolim, right? We're not going to allow any validity and recognition of his hafrasha. If he went ahead, this Jew who's a min was mafresh tevel, it's tevel. V'yesh omrim af banov mamzerim. Okay, so this will pick up right now on Omid base.